In this video, we're going to continue our discussion on Chapter 30 and unemployment, and we are going to, at the very least, begin talking about the types of unemployment. Just based on how long one of these is going to take, I imagine we're going to get through the first two, and then we'll have to save the last one and lump that in with some other stuff. Although, we might be able to get it all in. All right, not if I keep just talking to myself, though. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to go ahead and throw the three types of unemployment up on the board, and then we can go from there. All right, so the three types of unemployment that we're going to look at least are frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and cyclical unemployment. There are sometimes, depending on what textbook or what source you're looking at, there are some other types of unemployment that sometimes get thrown in there, but we're going to look at these types of unemployment: frictional, structural, and cyclical. All right, and so we're going to start with frictional. And we're not going to spend that long. We're going to spend most of the time on structural unemployment, but we are going to spend a little bit of time on frictional unemployment. All right, so frictional unemployment, this is short-term unemployment. All right, and specifically it's short-term unemployment caused by the ordinary difficulty of matching employee and employer. All right, so this is essentially the take your job and shove it type of unemployment, right? So this is frictional. We think friction, right? Friction between the employer and employer, right? Whether the employee just doesn't like working at the place that they're working at, or the employer doesn't like the employee, and not necessarily just like on a personal level, right? If they're not suited for each other, maybe the employer has a management style that doesn't really work for the employee, right? Maybe the employee takes naps during work hours, right? Whatever it is, right? That's where we have this frictional unemployment, right? So people getting fired or people leaving their job to go look for another one. So maybe they're just graduated, so they quit their job that only required a high school diploma, all right, to go look for another job. Although really most people just find the other job and then leave their current one, all right? But that is what frictional unemployment is. Pretty common. Usually lasts kind of weeks to months. That's the kind of time range we're looking at with our frictional unemployment. All right, and that's essentially it. That's really all we're going to say about that. We'll talk a little bit more about it later on, but really, as far as kind of definition and whatnot, that's it, right? There's not really much more to be said about frictional unemployment. It is what it is, right? That unemployment that's caused by, again, either employees being fired or employees leaving where they are employed to go find another job for whatever reason. All right, so now let's move on to structural unemployment. All right, so structural unemployment is persistent long-term unemployment. All right, so this is well, it says it's long-term, right? This is the unemployment, the type of unemployment that lasts much longer than a couple weeks or a couple months, right? Structural unemployment. Yeah, for most of us, we're probably not going to find ourselves in kind of a situation where we are structurally unemployed, right, or a member of the structural unemployment. Most of the time, it's going to be either frictional unemployment or cyclical, which we'll talk about later. Right? There are a couple of things that can cause structural unemployment. We're going to really just talk about one of these things, and then we're going to talk about some things that can exacerbate structural unemployment. All right, so one of the big things, right, or really just, I guess, before we start going into this thing that I've already written on the board. Really with structural unemployment, it's right there in the name, structural. It's about changes to the structure of employment. Right? So big structural changes in kind of the labor market are going to be what causes these changes, or causes structural unemployment. All right, so one of the big places where we could see something that would cause that would be what we call creative destruction. All right, so this is essentially when a new industry destroys an old industry. All right, and with the destruction of that industry, the destruction of all the jobs tied to that industry. Right? So when we have creative destruction, we can see this structural unemployment. Right? And we probably will. All right. So you think about when. See, I guess what came first. I guess 8-tracks did, right? Well, let's just think about kind of the music formats, all right? Kind of went from vinyl to 8-track to cassette to CD, now MP3, right? Well, with each new innovation in this field, right, there were also people that probably lost their jobs or at least lost them for a while, right? The people that kind of were I don't know if you collect or make vinyl. I assume you make it. That's not important, right? But the people that were providing the materials for vinyl records, right? They definitely saw a reduction in demand, right? When vinyl records kind of were no longer the major media format, right? So probably a lot of people that kind of gathered the materials needed to make vinyl, actually made the vinyl, that pressed the vinyl, so on and so forth, right? Those were jobs that were no longer a thing, right? And similar things probably happened for each new turnover, right? Each one of these innovations kind of destroyed some jobs, all right? Another classic example is switchboard operators, right? A long time ago, decades and decades ago, right, when you picked up a phone, you were connected to an operator, and then they connected you to somewhere else. You've probably seen the movies where people are just moving little things. I don't really understand how that works, but it does make it seem like they're doing a really cool job, right? But at a certain point, there were technological advancements that made that no longer needed, right? That was no longer a necessary thing, all right? That job, to my knowledge, does not exist anymore. All right, so when we have kind of innovation, right, when we have these new industries, they can destroy an old industry and leave people, right, without jobs, right? And it's not like a forever thing, but if they can't, get a niche market, right, for the thing they were already doing, then they're probably going to have to retrain, right? Some people, there might be, I'm 60 years old or whatever, and I've been doing this job all my life. I don't want to retrain. It's unfortunate, but that is kind of where we might see that structural unemployment. Right, another example of this, as I erase this and have my back turned to you, there is a British comedy duo called Mitchell and Webb. They had a skit called Bronze Orientation about kind of the introduction of the Bronze Age, kind of the transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age, and there was a character that is a chipper who kind of chipped flint and stone into kind of tool heads, blades, things of that nature, right? And when the person who was leading Bronze Orientation came by to talk to him and one of his friends, right, essentially said, right, he asked if bronze needed to be chipped, and he said, no, it doesn't, and essentially said, you're going to become obsolete, and if you want to kind of continue having a job, you're going to have to get a different job, all right? But that is creative destruction. That can cause that structural unemployment. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about differences in unemployment in the U.S. and in Europe, right? And we are still talking about structural unemployment. This is something, so creative destruction might be something that can cause structural unemployment and might start kind of this structural unemployment, but there are some things that countries can do, all right, that can either make things better or make things worse. All right, so in the United States, after we have a spike in the unemployment rate, right, we tend to have a decrease as whatever caused that kind of got better, you could say, right? Which is good news for us, because in the last video we saw that as of 2 months ago, May 2020, we had an unemployment rate of 13.3%. It's an extremely high unemployment rate. Hopefully once the coronavirus stuff has been dealt with, right, or even sooner than that, ideally, right, we're going to see that unemployment rate start to go down, right? But that's not the way it works in many European countries, right? In many European countries, and really we're talking kind of Western Europe and Southern Europe. So, well, just really Western Europe. I think that's everything other than the Baltic states. But that's what we're talking about. In those countries, or in some of those countries, when they have a spike in unemployment, it doesn't go down, right? Or it goes down much, much slower than it does in the United States, right? So why does this happen, all right? What's happening in Europe that's causing the structural unemployment to kind of essentially last longer, right? Rather than, right, kind of changing things up and getting people back to work, right? Well, the short answer to that is labor regulations. All right, now I'm obviously not going to be satisfied with just giving you the short answer, so let's talk about some of those unemployment, or excuse me, some of those labor regulations that are doing this. All right, the first one we're going to talk about is unemployment benefits. All right, how you deal with unemployment benefits is obviously going to affect, right, your unemployment rate, right? Incentives matter. What incentives are you providing? All right. So this, these unemployment benefits, I'm about to put some numbers up here, kind of some percentages. This is kind of insurance, housing assistance, all right, kind of all this other stuff, all right? And I'm going to put up some numbers. What these numbers represent is we're going to do these for the United States. We are going to do them for France, Germany, and if I can fit it in here, down at the bottom, I'm going to throw Spain in here as well. All right, so these are the percentage of a worker's take-home pay that is replaced by unemployment benefits. All right, so when you lose a job in each of these states, all right, how much of your kind of take-home pay are you going to get back in these unemployment benefits? All right, and we're going to break it down by year because it does change. All right, so in the first year, in the United States, you get 38% of your take-home pay in benefits. All right, pretty low. I would not want to have to live off of 38% of my salary. All right, in France, it's 80% for the first year. In Germany, it's 74%, and in Spain, it is 70%. All right. Actually, before I start yammering on, let's go ahead and fill in the rest of this. All right. So for the second and third years, the United States drops dramatically to 14%. All right. In France, we go from 80% to 62%. In Germany, we go from 74%. We decrease a whopping 2% to 72% for the second and third years. And in Spain, we go from 70 to 55%. All right. And then finally, we'll just go ahead since we've already got the rest of it up here. For the fourth and fifth year, U.S. holds steady at 14%. France goes to 60%. Germany stays at 72%. And in Spain, it falls to 39%. All right. So looking at this, right, there should be some things that kind of make sense, right? Why the unemployment rate tends to stay high, right? Remain high after a spike in countries like France, Germany, and Spain, right? There's not as much pressure to return back to work, right? Spain is the one that gives the lowest percentage for the fourth and fifth year, and it's 1% higher than in the United States, all right, for the first year, right? In the United States, all right, the unemployment benefits are structured so that this is this is emergency assistance, essentially, right? We're going to help you out, but all right, you're not going to be able to live off of this, right? And it encourages, incentivizes the person receiving those unemployment benefits to go find a job sooner rather than later, right? If you get 80% of your take-home pay, right, and presumably all you have to do is just show that you're actively looking for work or whatever their requirements are, right? That doesn't sound like a terribly bad deal, right? And even at 62, 60%, 74, 72, 72. Now I'm just saying numbers. But again, the point is that with these unemployment benefits, all right, the higher those benefits are, the less incentive there is to return to work. In the U.S., right, when you lose that job, you get those unemployment benefits, it's 38%, and it's going to go down drastically from there, right? And so you need to use those resources, well, not really use them sparingly. It's not like you need to ration them or anything, but you're just not going to have a whole lot, right? And you're going to want to get back to work, right? You're going to want to find a job, right? In some of these other countries, that might not be the case. All right, so higher levels of unemployment benefits can cause unemployment to remain high after a spike, right, and make that structural unemployment last even longer. All right, the next one is the effect of minimum wage and unions. All right, so the unions and minimum wage and the unions have similar effects on unemployment, the unemployment rate. Remember that the minimum wage is a price floor, right? And when we have a price floor, one of the effects of a price floor is a surplus, right? In this case, it's a surplus of labor, right? Unemployment. And the higher the minimum wage is, right, the higher that surplus is going to be, the more unemployment you're going to have. Right? One thing that makes this hit Europe especially hard is that Europeans tend to have minimum wages that are higher relative to the median wage than we do in the United States. Right? So in the US, the minimum wage is 32% of the median wage. In France, all right, we're just going to talk about France in this one, the minimum wage is 62% of median wage. All right, that's a pretty significant difference. All right, and so that's going to cause unemployment rates to remain higher, right? Because fewer jobs will be offered, right? Or another way we could think of it, if we're kind of again going with our, actually I'm going to just go ahead and do that. If we're going with our idea that this is a price floor, and suppliers are the laborers, employers are the demanders, right? Remember that quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied when we have a price floor. All right, so when we have this price floor, all right, well actually, let's do this. I'm going to bring it down a little bit. All right, so let's say that we've got this price floor. All right, so we can see, all right, the differences between our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied, right? That is our surplus, right? That is our unemployment, right? So there, right, we don't have any numbers on this, so we can't really tell the size of the unemployment, but that doesn't really matter, right? Because let's imagine that this is the minimum wage for the United States, right? And then we look at the minimum wage for France, right? So essentially just a higher minimum wage. That's all we're going to do, right? Well, the higher that minimum wage is, the bigger the difference between our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied, right? Employers are going to demand less labor, right? They might just shut down, or they might try to transition to something other than labor, right? Find a substitute, right? And so kind of the higher that minimum wage goes, right, then we can expect to see fewer jobs being offered, right? Probably can expect to see higher levels of mechanization, right? Having machinery instead of using capital to replace labor. All right, and that higher minimum wage relative to the median wage means that more people are affected, right? In the U.S., just looking at some data from that current population survey, right? And said about probably 1.5 million people kind of work at the minimum wage. All right. Now that doesn't include all the people that work kind of slightly above the minimum wage, but that's kind of 1.5 people working at or below the minimum wage, right? 1.5 people out of 325 million, right? That's probably, if we, you know, that's not having a huge effect on us, right? But if the minimum wage was a higher percentage of the median wage, and the median wage is kind of the wage right in the middle, so if we put everybody's wages in order from smallest to largest, right, the one right in the middle, that's our median wage, right? If it's a higher percentage of that median wage, right, it's going to affect more people, right? And so it wouldn't just be kind of younger kids who aren't getting these jobs because at one point that's who was, and still kind of getting back to it these days, who works those jobs, right? But increasing the minimum wage, while beneficial to the people who still have jobs after that, it's not very beneficial to all the other consumers, right? That are now having to pay higher prices. Not really good for the producer, right? Because they're having to pay higher input costs in the form of wages, right? And it's definitely not good for the people who lost their job because now they're too expensive, right? And they're not worth the money that the employer would have to pay to keep them. All right, so a higher minimum wage, all right, especially a higher minimum wage relative to the median wage, right? If you have that and then you have a spike in unemployment, that can cause that unemployment to last longer than it otherwise would, right? So now we go on to unions. So a union is an association of workers that use collective bargaining to establish contracts. All right, I'm sure we were all probably at least somewhat familiar with the concept of unions, but that is our textbook definition for the union. All right, so unions do the same thing that higher medium wages do. All right, they make the cost of labor higher, right? That leads to fewer jobs being available, right? Which again, they're great for the people that get them, right? But a lot of people don't, right? Most people don't get that job, right? Which is also why you often hear, at the very least, rumors of nepotism and cronyism with regards to union jobs, all right? So let's kind of look at the difference in how unions operate in the US and in Europe, right? Or really not how they operate, but kind of just about unions. So in the United States, 87% of workers are at will. All right, so what it means to be at will just means, at will employment means that you can be fired for any reason at any time, and you can quit for any reason at any time, all right? You do not have to stay at that job, and that job does not have to keep you. That is, of course, the caveat here is, of course, if it's because you fire somebody because you're being discriminatory, that is still against the law, right? But as long as somebody hasn't really, I mean, honestly, you can just fire somebody because you don't like them, right? If you're the employer, if you just don't like one of your workers, as long as it's not because of anything like their sex, their race, their religion, or anything, sexual identity, anything like that, you can just fire them. Right? In contrast, in European countries, %80 or more of workers are governed by a union contract. Right, so with a higher level of unionization in these European countries, right, again, you're going to have a larger effect, all right? If 87% of the workers in the U.S. are at will, that means 13% of them presumably are in unions, right, or are governed by a union contract, right? So 13% compared to 80% or so, right? That is a big difference, right? Makes sense why people kind of can get back into jobs easily at the U.S., right, or more easily in the U.S. after a high unemployment rate when compared to workers in European countries. All right. All right, this video is already longer than I want it to be, but we've got one last, we got one last thing that falls in these veins, and then we'll do the other thing in a different video. This is all connected. I don't want to really split it up, but we're going to have to. All right, so the last thing that we're going to talk about, and we're probably not going to talk about it for too long, are employment protection laws. All right, so again, most employees in the United States are at will. There are actually, I think, at-will states where it's illegal to not be at will. You kind of have to be at will. That's not the case in a lot of, or in some European countries. All right, Portugal, for instance, forbids at-will employment. All right, actually, I'm not going to write all these down because there's a few of them and it's going to take us longer. All right, but so Portugal forbid at-will employment. Some of the other employment protection laws they have, so these are protecting the employment of the employee, making sure that they keep their job. Employers are required to notify the government when firing workers. So if you have somebody that's not doing their job and you want to fire them, you have to call the government and get permission before you can do that. All right. They also require permission to lay off groups of workers. All right. So if there's an economic downturn and you need to lay off some people, you got to ask the government first. All right. Lastly, as far as what I'm going to read off, firms do not decide who is fired. Right? They don't get to decide which of their workers are fired. It's I don't know the system exactly, but the way it's done, it's akin to a first in, first out system. Right? The most recent person hired is the first fired. All right, kind of based on seniority. All right. The real point of all of this is that these employment protection laws increase the cost of hiring and firing workers. All right, if you've got somebody applying to work for you and you know that you're not going to get to just decide on your own if you want to fire them or not, and you're going to have to ask somebody in the government to allow you to fire this person, right? So in essence, there's a possibility that you could just be stuck with this person if you just don't like them, or if they're just not good at their job, right? That's going to make you a lot less willing to hire that person in the first place, right? If you know that it's gonna, there's a possibility that they're not gonna work out, which is a possibility with anyone you hire, right? But then if they don't work out in a place like Portugal, right, the costs of getting rid of that person are extremely high. And we can see that in some other instances. Well, we're not going to get into that right now, but it increase those costs, all right? And when you increase the costs, right, it's going to make people reticent to hire anyone. So there's going to be fewer jobs available. Again, fewer jobs open, all right, fewer chances to get that job, right? Those unemployment rates are going to stay higher in Europe than they will in the United States. All right, but we'll go ahead and end this here. In the next video, we're going to wrap this chapter up. We will be looking at one last thing about structural unemployment. We're going to talk about some of the things that can help lower it, rather than just the things that make it remain high. We'll also talk about cyclical unemployment, and then start talking about labor force participation and some other things like that. But that will be in the next video, and I will see you then.